For 30 long years, a family in Berkeley, California, woke up every single morning with the same agonizing question: who killed Maria Weidhofer? It was a crime that defied logic, a brutal act in a place meant for peace, leaving behind a trail that went cold almost as soon as it started. Imagine going for a morning jog in a beautiful park and never coming home, leaving your loved ones to wonder for decades if the person responsible was still out there, walking the same streets. But today, the silence is finally over, and the truth has surfaced in a way no one saw coming. Welcome to the Crime Chapter, where we dive deep into the cases that time almost forgot, uncovering the dark secrets hidden within cold files. Before we get into the chilling details of how forensics finally cracked this case wide open after 20 years, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing these important stories to light, and you won't want to miss the resolution of this incredible investigation. Maria Weidhofer was a 30-year-old nurse with a heart of gold. She was the kind of person who dedicated her life to helping others, working long shifts to ensure her patients were cared for. Friends described her as vibrant, full of life, and someone who found peace in nature. In November of 1990, Maria decided to spend her morning doing something she loved: jogging through the scenic trails of Tilden Regional Park. It was a crisp autumn day, and the park was a popular spot for hikers and runners looking to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. But on that particular Thursday, the serenity of the woods was shattered. Maria never made it back to her car. When she didn't show up for her planned activities, worry began to set in. The search started almost immediately, but the hope of finding her safe quickly turned into a nightmare. Her body was discovered in a secluded, wooded area off a popular trail. She had been brutally assaulted and murdered. The community was in shock. How could something so horrific happen in a place so beautiful? The initial investigation was intense. Detectives from all over the area converged on Tilden Park, combing through every inch of the crime scene. They looked for footprints, discarded items, or any sign of a struggle that could lead them to a suspect. In 1990, forensic science wasn't what it is today. While investigators collected physical evidence, including biological samples from the scene, the technology to analyze it was limited. They interviewed hundreds of people, followed up on every tip that came through the door, and looked into known offenders in the area. But despite their best efforts, the leads started to dry up. There were no witnesses who saw the attack, and no one could identify a suspicious person in the park that morning. The case that had gripped the headlines slowly began to fade from the front pages, and eventually, it was reclassified as a cold case. For Maria's family, this was the beginning of a long, painful waiting game. Decades passed. The 90s turned into the 2000s, and then the 2010s. Investigators who had originally worked the case retired, passing their files down to a new generation of detectives. But Maria was never forgotten. Her family kept her memory alive, constantly pushing for answers and hoping that one day, technology would catch up with the evidence left behind. They lived with the heavy burden of not knowing. Every time a new person was arrested for a similar crime, they wondered if that was the man who took Maria away. Here at the Crime Chapter, we often see how these long stretches of silence can break a family. But the Weidhofers stayed strong, waiting for the day the phone would finally ring with real news. If you're finding this story as gripping as we do, let us know in the comments what you think about cold cases being solved decades later. Do you think justice delayed is still justice served? Share your thoughts while we continue with the breakthrough. The turning point finally came when investigators decided to take a fresh look at the evidence stored in the police locker. They knew that DNA technology had made massive leaps forward. What was once impossible to detect could now be mapped out with incredible precision. In 2020, detectives submitted the biological evidence from Maria's case for advanced DNA testing. They weren't just looking for a simple match anymore. They were looking for a profile that could be run through modern databases. The name that popped up on the screen changed everything. It provided a direct link to a man who had lived in the area at the time of the murder. But the investigation didn't stop there. Just having a name isn't enough to close a case like this. They needed to build a timeline and prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this individual was in Tilden Park that morning. The detectives began to reconstruct a life from 30 years ago. They looked at old records, employment history, and previous run-ins with the law. It was like putting together a giant puzzle where half the pieces had been lost to time. As the police dug deeper, they realized that the suspect wasn't a stranger to the system. He had a record of violence, but for some reason, he had never been linked to Maria. This is the part of the story that often frustrates people, the realization that a dangerous individual was out there while a family suffered. But the focus now was on making sure the evidence was airtight. They needed to ensure that when they finally made an announcement, it would stick. The tension was building. The family was notified that there was a significant break in the case, but they were told to be patient. After 30 years, every hour felt like an eternity. They were so close to the truth, yet still so far from seeing a person behind bars for what happened to Maria. The name that finally flashed across the investigators' screens was John Arthur Bolt. For the detectives who had lived and breathed this case for years, seeing that name was a moment of absolute triumph. But it was quickly followed by a complicated reality. When they began tracking Bolt's history to prepare for an arrest, they discovered that the man who had haunted the Weidhofer family's nightmares was no longer alive to face a judge or a jury. John Arthur Bolt had passed away in 2014 at the age of 66 while living in a nursing home. He had died of natural causes, taking his dark secrets to the grave 6 years before the DNA technology finally caught up to him. This revelation was a massive blow to the team, yet it didn't stop them from finishing what they started. They needed to be 100% certain that Bolt was their man. So they began an even more intensive look into it. What they found was a pattern of behavior that fit the profile of a predator. John Arthur Bolt wasn't just some random person. He had a history of making women feel unsafe. Investigations revealed that in the years following Maria's murder, Bolt had been involved in other incidents that landed him in the system, which is ultimately how his DNA profile ended up in the national database. Back in 1990, he was living a somewhat transient lifestyle in the East Bay area, often spending time in the very parks where Maria went jogging. He was a man who blended into the background, someone you might pass on a trail and never think twice about. But underneath that ordinary exterior was someone capable of the ultimate betrayal of human life. The realization that he had lived another 24 years after Maria's death, likely without a shred of remorse, a difficult pill to swallow. It's the kind of detail that makes you realize how fragile justice. Even though Bolt was dead, the Berkeley Police Department and the Cold Case Unit didn't just close the file. They went back to the original evidence from Tilden Park and performed even more specific tests to ensure there was no possibility of a mistake. They compared the DNA found on Maria's clothing and at the scene directly to the samples on file for Bolt. The match was undeniable. It was a 1 in a billion certainty. This was the moment the detectives had been waiting for. They could finally pick up the phone and call Maria's siblings. Can you imagine receiving that call after 30 years? To hear a voice on the other end telling you that the monster has finally been identified, but he's already gone? It's a mixture of relief and a fresh wave of grief. The family finally learned that Maria hadn't been targeted for who she was, but rather because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with a man who should have never been free. The impact of this discovery vibrated through the entire Berkeley community. For decades, women had been wary of jogging alone in Tilden Park, and a shadow of fear had hung over the beautiful trails of Northern California. Knowing that the killer was identified brought a sense of collective healing to the area. It proved that no matter how much time passes, the truth has a way of coming to light. Here at the Crime Chapter, we see these stories often, but the Maria Weidhofer case stands out because of the sheer persistence of the investigators. They never let her memory fade. They kept those biological samples preserved in a way that allowed 21st century science to do what 20th century detectives couldn't. This case is a testament to the power of forensic evolution and the dedication of those who refuse to let go. Before we get into the final legacy of Maria's story and how her family chose to move forward, I want to take a second to ask you guys for a huge favor. If you find these deep dives into cold cases important, please share this video with someone who loves true crime documentaries. Sharing helps these stories reach a wider audience and keeps the pressure on for other unsolved cases to get the attention they deserve. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How do you feel about the fact that John Arthur Bolt died before he could be brought to justice? Does knowing his name bring enough closure, or do you feel the system failed Maria by taking so long? Let's get a conversation going down below. I read as many of your comments as I can. For Maria's family, the news brought a quiet kind of peace. They didn't get to see Bolt in handcuffs, and they didn't get to deliver victim impact statements in a courtroom, but they did get the one thing they had prayed for, an answer. They no longer had to look at every stranger and wonder. They could finally replace the horrific what-ifs with the solid who. They chose to remember Maria not as a victim in a wooded area, but as the compassionate nurse who loved the outdoors and cared deeply for her community. They released a statement expressing their gratitude to the police, noting that while the journey was long and painful, they were thankful that the mystery was finally solved. It allows them to focus on her. This case also served as a major wake-up call for law enforcement agencies across the country. It highlighted the importance of properly storing old evidence. If those samples from 1990 hadn't been kept in the right conditions, this match never would have happened. Now, more than ever, departments are looking back at their unsolvable cases from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, hoping that a similar breakthrough is just one DNA test away. Maria's legacy is now intertwined with the advancement of forensic science. Her story is a beacon of hope for thousands of other families who are still waiting for their own phone call. It reminds us that cold doesn't mean forgotten, and that time is no longer the enemy of. As we wrap up this look into the life and tragic passing of Maria Weidhofer, we are reminded of the resilience of the human spirit. Maria's life was cut short, but her story has helped pave the way for a new era of criminal investigation. The trails in Tilden Park are a little brighter now, no longer haunted by an unidentified ghost. The crime chapter is dedicated to bringing you these stories of truth and resolution, ensuring that the names of the victims are remembered long after the killers are gone. We hope this deep dive gave you a better understanding of how far we've come in the fight for justice. Thank you for spending this time with us today, for your engagement, and for helping us grow this community of truth seekers. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and we will see you in the next chapter.